God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the I Don't Belong Here show, and I am your host, Samantha Benigno. I am a behavioral scientist, a career psychotherapist, a sixth-year PhD candidate in clinical psychology, a master's level psychologist and counselor, and I am here breaking down the Justice for John O'Keefe case. It is hot like hell in New York City today. So I wasn't even going to record a video today. And then I ran across this clip, this spot with friend of John O'Keefe, John Jackson. I just had to show you this because it highlights so many of the concepts that I've been talking about, that I've been screaming and yelling about since I started my channel. And it answers a lot of the questions that many of you have had about whether or not the O'Keefe family might have started to shift their thinking, hearing the defense's case in chief, hearing all of the scientific evidence that proved beyond a reasonable doubt, certainly, that John O'Keefe was not hit by a car and that the injuries that he sustained were not made by a car accident. So let's take a look.
His death not only shattered his loved ones, it ignited a firestorm of controversy that would shake the foundations of law enforcement and justice in Massachusetts. The woman accused of his murder was found not guilty by the jury, leaving the question of what happened to John O'Keefe unanswered. How are the friends and family of John O'Keefe handling the verdict? It was obvious to me what they believed happened here. They believed Karen Read was responsible. So how are friends and family handling this not guilty verdict? To help us answer that, I'd like to bring in John Jackson. He is a close friend of John O'Keefe. They were good friends since college. I can understand this can't be easy, but I need you to help us understand what it's like from the other side. That story hasn't been told enough. How are you personally handling what transpired and the verdict in this case?
That's the lead-in. That's the lead-in to this. That's the footage of the lead-in to this. Vinny, we saw you out there. We saw you with the pink tie. We saw you just bathing in the sea of pink.
Slow down.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not a defender of court TV. If anything, I've thrown them under the bus because of their shoddy and often ridiculous coverage of the case. But I think Vinny has, at the very least, deliberately maintained a neutral stance, has tried never to be on one side or the other. But John Jackson sees him out there, covering the case, during jury deliberation. Vinny was there each day. I saw him myself.
Yes.
What are the limits?
Because of that, and the fact that John Jackson is emotional about this, he comes in and starts attacking Vinny. And of course, in this case, he's absolutely incorrect. You're going to see right here and right now how his view of reality has been superimposed onto what he's seeing, the objective sense data that is in front of him.
Didn't wear a pink tie, John. Didn't wear a pink tie,
John. You hold it up. You held it up, right?
No, I didn't. I held up a red tie, John. If you
See, okay, here it is. Look at this look on John Jackson's face. So he really believes that he's caught Vinny in a lie here. Completely uninformed that on verdict days, whenever Vinny covers a trial, he wears a red tie. And in this case, again, he's tried to stay neutral, but John Jackson, again, remember, belief overrides what our senses see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. That's how powerful your beliefs are. And when you add really strong emotion, you have what amounts to not only confirmation bias, but to John Jackson, look at the look on his face. He is sure that he has just nailed Vinny in a lie. He is sure of it. Right? It's really something to watch this happening in real time.
Watch me, if you've watched my career,
So
every verdict I wear a red tie. So
your
I switched
career
from
is
the
interesting.
purple. From the purple.
The career is interesting.
Okay, this is the way it's going to go. Let's
the career
go.
is fantastic. The career is fantastic. Look, up until this case, we all watched you.
So now he's trying to walk it back, and he's saying something even more telling here without realizing it. He's saying, up until this case, we all watched you. Well, if you weren't watching, how would you know what side Vinny is on? How would you know what his feelings really were? And that's why Vinny's fighting back, because he's like, bro, you're wrong. Like, you're just flat out wrong. And you're accusing me of stuff that's just false. So John Jackson, of course, then feels bad because he's a nice guy, obviously. And I think he tries to walk it back because he felt bad, but not because he thinks he was suddenly wrong. He feels bad because he came in hot and attacking. And he's going to explain why he was so angry when he first came on with Vinny in just a second.
All did. We all watched, any case that had any kind of interest to us, we watched. But I just watched that interview with that juror. Well, I was here to talk about something completely different. And it's unfortunate because...
Okay, let's talk about whatever you want to talk about, John. I'll give you an opportunity. It's not a problem.
I can't believe what I just heard from that. I just watched the show, so I can't believe what I just heard that juror say. So many things. I mean, I just went over it. I couldn't believe what I was listening to. It believes the dog bite theory, but they didn't really present it at trial.
So what John is telling us here is that he had just watched a segment as he was waiting to come on this spot here with Vinny, and that they had one of the jurors on, and that juror was talking about why they voted not guilty. And he's watching that. And as he's watching that and feeling like some great injustice has been done onto him, he's getting more and more angry, which explains why he came in and so charged, right? And he still has it right now. He's very emotional, and he's outraged by the things that the juror said, which of course is going to help us because it gives us insight into where the mind of the O'Keefe family and friends, where their mind was and what they were focused on as they saw and heard all the evidence be rolled out.
Her words. Barros, she talked about Officer Barros. She apparently missed the cross-examination, although she did hat tip to Mr. Hank Brennan for his cross-examinations. But
so fascinating here. Now, if you've seen Officer Barros do any interviewing since the trial.
And I told him, the last thing I said was that, there was a crack, a piece is missing and it was not completely damaged. And, they talked about a picture, and I said, no, I wouldn't agree to a picture of completely damaged taillight.
But he also explains that the picture, that the fast one that Hank tried to pull on him, essentially was a byproduct of having seen a lot of those pictures be circulated. And because he's particularly interested in this taillight, because it's something that he personally, it was a whole experience he was personally involved in, right? He was on site at Karen Reed's house when they came to take the car away. So he, of course, was paying closer attention than probably even we are about the taillight and the images of the taillight. So he couldn't be sure when Hank Brennan said, is this the picture? It's really interesting to me because it's clear as we go through this, he thinks of himself as a smart guy and as a man who tries to be objective. And he really believes that about himself, as you're going to see. And so he's struggling because he's trying to look at the evidence objectively, but he can't, because if Karen Reed is guilty, in order for her to be guilty, your brain cannot view the evidence objectively. It's purely impossible, right? So he has to, in order to hold that belief that Karen Reed is guilty, he has to systematically ignore and literally ignore. Remember, belief is more powerful than the sensory information coming in. So his brain is going to literally block, hide, or deceive by not showing him the bits of information that would be exonerating for Karen. And it's going to highlight any little bits here and there, like, for example, Hank Brennan's cross-examination of Barrows, like somehow him getting that image wrong means that he didn't actually see the cracked taillight, right? I mean, it's absurd. And it can obviously both be true at the same time, but John Jackson can't hold those two things as true. So he has to highlight Hank Brennan's award-winning cross-examination because that matches his belief that Karen Read is guilty. And you're going to see this pattern over and over again in everything he says.
Hey, look, I'd love to talk about Johnny.
John, let me give you an opportunity. You can talk about whatever you want. As a guest on this show, you can talk about whatever you want right now. You've got the microphone. We've got the camera. You have a question for me. If you want to talk about the juror, the way she saw the case, that's fine. You've answered my question that I have already. I sense that you are absolutely livid. You're unhappy. There's a sense of anger. So my question's answered.
Yeah.
I'll give you an opportunity to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
So let me just run through it. Okay, it's been a couple days. So the first couple days, you know, obviously we were all together when the verdict came out, and it was rough, man. It was you know, you sat through the whole case and you watch everything come and go, all the evidence come and go, and look, to us, the prosecution put on a good case, and to us, that data from her car and from Johnny's cell phone told the whole story. Right. So.
All right. So I want you to think back to Shannon Burgess's testimony, because this is the testimony that John Jackson believes was the most important testimony of the entire trial. Okay. A testimony I'm pretty certain he probably didn't even understand in its entirety. A testimony that most certainly proved that the car did not register an accident of any kind. And by the way, Burgess's data doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove anything. It proves nothing. And part of the thing that you have to understand about the telematics data, and this is something that I had to get schooled on because I was really interested in the telematics data, really interested. I was interested in it for a different reason. I was trying to figure out how the key cycle data would have lined up. And what I came to understand from people who have helped me via email and other outlets, other sources, friends of friends, was that this data is just plain and simple not meant to be used in the criminal justice system for anything. And that by trying to match up these different types of data sources, it gets very messy. It is very difficult to say conclusively what any of it means. And it's very difficult to believe that any or all of it is conclusive enough for a conviction. Like, this is not the kind of information that you would hang your hat on to convict a woman of murder for the rest of her life. There's just not enough evidence. And that's the plain and simple truth of the matter. And a testimony that was given by someone who is fundamentally dishonest, who has been lying on his resume.
Now let's look at the first line that relates to education. It states Bachelor's of General Science in Mathematics and Business Administration, correct?
That is what it states, yes.
And the date is 2022, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware that there's no degree at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, called a Bachelor of General Science in Mathematics and Business Administration?
Yes, I am. And that is one of the errors I've identified.
And what you just articulated, you do not possess as you sit here today, correct?
That is correct.
What you possess is an associate's degree, correct?
Correct.
And when did you obtain that associate's degree?
So that would have been 2015.
So this is a third example of a document that incorrectly states that you have a Bachelor of Science when you do not possess that degree, correct?
It has errors or outdated information, correct?
Are you familiar with the term mendacity?
I am not.
This is the evidence that John Jackson and the O'Keefe family is pointing to for certainty. This is the certain evidence that Karen Read killed John is really telling, right? It's like hanging on by a thread. Then he points to the cell phone evidence, but the cell phone could really go either way. Now, I've done whole videos on just the cell phone data, and that could be hours worth of analysis. So I don't want to go through that here and now. But if we're going to go ahead and look at cell phone data, then we have no choice but to just look at the timeline and say, well, if Karen Read, if she connects to the Wi-Fi at John's house at 12:36, and the Commonwealth is claiming that this accident happens at 12:32, it is just not possible for Karen Read to have made it to One Meadows and also been responsible for any kind of accident with John. So these things are just impossible, right? That is just a objectively impossibility. But somehow, again, John Jackson sees that the cell phone data and the telematics information is somehow a certain evidence, absolutely surefire evidence that Karen Read is guilty. Never mind the injuries, never mind that there was no accident, never mind those things. And it's fascinating, right? Because, yeah, I mean, think about it. If you are going to be on the other side, just put yourself in his shoes. If you're going to believe, and you have you have to believe, okay? Imagine that you have to believe that Karen Read is guilty. And you ask me, well, why, Sam, would I have to believe that? Well, for this family, it's not just that they, don't like Karen Read. It's much more than that, because if I am to accept that Karen Read is not responsible for this, then my brain has to shift in its thinking to start to look at who is responsible, which then starts to lead me down the road of people who have gone out of their way to be a part of my life over the last 3 years. People who were allegedly on my side, so much so that I invited them to be seated with me at different points throughout this trial and the last trial. So for the O'Keefe family, and even for John Jackson, the idea that Karen Read is not guilty is probably terrifying, because then it starts to allow for your mind to wander into spaces that are very, very scary.
So, we're not hearing too much about that right now from these jurors. I'm a little surprised. Look, I came out that night. I said, look, we respect the jury's decision. I mean, that's how it is, and it's okay. That's the process. I'm to be honest, I'm stunned at what I just saw. I mean, that's kind of where I'm at. I wasn't really there until I just saw that interview, and it kind of put me there. It is literally like the social media side of this, and the blogging side of this, and the law tuber side of this just came out of that juror's mouth. All
right. Now, again, put yourself in this guy's shoes. If you believe wholeheartedly that the most important evidence in this case came out of Shannon Burgess's mouth, came out of the telematics system, and the juror clearly was more apt to believe the story that the defense told, then the only way that you're going to make sense of what just happened is to blame it on Turtle Boy, is to blame it on all of us. She must have been listening to us. The fix is in. She must be lying about the fact that she wasn't listening to social media. She must have been listening to us. We were all in her head. We were tampering with the jury. And of course, if you did listen to I believe Paula, and I don't remember her last name off the top of my head, is the person that he's talking about, although I'm not 100% sure. The attorney from Brazil who has been doing a lot of interviews and been attacked on X and wherever else. I think when you listen to the jurors, the sense that you get is that the defense put on a very strong showing that these were level-headed people. You've heard some of these jurors say that they went in to jury deliberations inclined to believe that Karen Read was guilty and came out saying there's not enough evidence to convict her. That's the bottom line. These were not people who were asked, and they were very clear about this, they were not asked to figure out who killed John O'Keefe. They were asked to determine whether or not Karen Read was guilty of the charges that were put in front of them. And there wasn't enough evidence because of the shoddy police investigation. And that is the story that the defense deliberately tried to tell here. So what they did worked. And John Jackson, in his way of trying to make sense of it, is it's our fault. And, I will tell you something. If you had asked me, what would the O'Keefe family and friends be thinking if the Commonwealth loses this case? I would have told you they're going to blame all of us. I absolutely would have told you that. So it's very predictable because, again, you have to understand, if you believe and you in your soul want to believe that Karen Read is guilty, you're limited by how many different facts you can point to. You're limited by the sensory data that you have in front of you to point to make that case. So it's not difficult to predict who they're going to blame because there's only so many things that you can blame. Does that make sense?
She's stunned. I was calm. I wasn't here, but I can't believe I just heard it. It kind of put me in a position, and I'm sorry. Didn't mean to start off that way.
Hey, John, your emotions are real. You're entitled to your emotions.
Of course they are.
This is an incredible loss. And I've seen cases of not guilties before. I know it can be crushing. I know it can create anger. And I just want to hear it. I want to hear your side of this. So hearing what we heard from juror number 11 tonight and the way things went down, where do you point blame anywhere for why this result came out, a result that you don't believe in at all?
Yeah, so obviously there's a couple places we'd like to put some blame, but let me start off again. We respect the process, right? If the process is fair, if there's no fingers on the scale, we respect the process.
Gee, can you think of anybody who had their fingers on the scales of justice throughout these Karen Read trials? Is there anybody that I can think of who had their fingers on the scales of justice?
What was it like having basically the judge tied your hands, the defense's hands behind your backs, didn't she? What was that? What was that like?
First things, it was difficult. I mean, that was the challenge, right? So Hank Brennan came on as this, sort of self-proclaimed stalwart of justice. We're going to make sure that Karen Read gets a fair trial. That was just lip service. It was anything but that. The Commonwealth had a theme and a theory going into this case that they did not want the jurors, in my view, they did not want the jurors to actually hear the evidence. They had no interest in having the jurors presented with the truth and the evidence on both sides, even playing field. Everything they did strategically was to try to hide evidence, try to hide witnesses, try to hide experts from the jurors. They filed motion after motion after motion. And, well, that's one thing. I mean, I can handle a prosecutor. I can beat most prosecutors with my hands tied behind my back. I know evidence very, very, very well. The problem is when the judge is on the Commonwealth side and tends to lean toward the Commonwealth, that makes life very difficult. And I've got example after example after example of the Judge Cannoni making very bizarre rulings that just did benefit the Commonwealth over the defense. And they're myriad.
Yeah, we would get, people would be texting in and saying, why doesn't Jackson object to this or that? And I said, after, he's been overruled, his objection's been overruled about 1 million times in a row. I mean, he's just pissing off the jury if he keeps objecting because he knows what's going to happen, right?
There was a witness I took, Howie. This is still just shocking to me. There was a witness that I took on direct examination. It's direct, and it's an expert, and just allowed to lead experts in every state in the union. You can have moments where you lead experts. Every question I asked was objected to by Hank Brennan, and 100% of his objections were sustained.
Sustained.
Objection.
Sustained.
Correct.
Sustained.
Is that 10%?
That is 10%.
Objection, move to strike.
Yeah, there's sustained and a move. It's stricken.
Objection.
Sustained. I'm going to see you type out for a second.
To January 29th. Objection.
So can you narrow that, Mr. Jackson?
Sure. I object to the whole line.
Then I need to see you type out. How much longer? I'm just trying to figure out.
I'm wrapping it up, Judge.
Okay.
It's not going to be long.
I'm not curbing you in any way. We just
understand. Respectfully, it won't be very much longer. Objection.
I'm going to allow it. Do you agree with that?
Objection.
I'm going to allow that.
No.
Objection.
I'm going to allow it.
Do any of the tech stream events or any of the data that you've reviewed, either yourself through Mr. Burgess's report, through Dr. Welch's report, do any of the data indicate that there was a collision on January 29th, 2022 at any time? Objection.
Ask it differently.
I've never seen that in 30 years of practice.
And the jurors spoke. So that's it, right? I mean, we understand that's it. But
and again, you see how he keeps trying to ground himself by being level-headed. He keeps trying to say, we understand. And, while he's saying that to us, he's really saying it to himself. He's trying to convince himself of these things as much as he is saying them to us. And remember, it's only been a few days that this man has had to sit with all of this, and he probably hasn't spoken that much about his feelings, as most, certainly men, hate to be a cliche. Most men don't talk about their feelings. So Vinny's asking to talk about his feelings, and he's probably not processed them very much. So now they're kind of coming out all over the place, and it's coming out exactly as he's experiencing it in real time.
What we don't appreciate is the narrative that got away from us pretty early was a false narrative. So, trial 1, trial 2, both of them. And the popularity of the movement grew.
So again, the narrative that got away from us is a false narrative. When you actually sit down and you go piece by piece through the evidence in this case, and in particular, if you start to veer into the mountain of consciousness of guilt evidence, if we start talking about things like the 911 call, the butt dials, Chloe, the lying from Colin Albert, lying from Allie McCabe, lying from, my God, Brian Higgins, start looking at the videos, the police station, obviously the waterfall. When we start looking at the whole picture, the consciousness of guilt evidence by itself, I believe in any other trial, in any other run-of-the-mill murder trial in America, would be enough to put these people away for many lifetimes. But because this is such a high-profile case and it's people who are protected by the Boston Police Department and by the Commonwealth, it's not enough. But it would be enough, I promise you, if this was any other Joe Schmo schmuck on the street that we were talking about. So it's fascinating because, again, remember, the one belief that John Jackson has to protect above all else is Karen Reed is guilty. So if that's your starting point, perceptually, and I want to be very clear here, I'm speaking literally, we're talking about the structure and function of a brain. It's fascinating. It's one of my favorite things to study in the entire world. It's not an easy thing to study, but what neuroscientists and behavioral neuroscientists in particular now understand very clearly is that factors like mood, how I feel in any given moment, and beliefs and expectations, what I expect to see based on what I've always seen and what I believe, act like filters over sensory information. They essentially override objective sensory information coming in from the world outside. So you're not actually seeing what's really there. You're seeing what's there through a filter, through the filter of your emotions and your beliefs. And if your starting point is Karen Read is guilty, you have to really bend over backwards to find a way to blame everything under the sun for why things aren't going your way, except for what's really obvious to the rest of us, which is there's no actual evidence that Karen Read did anything wrong besides drive intoxicated.
And as the movement grew, it drew in more and more media types, traditional media, new media, drew them all in, and they went and chased the clicks, and they chased the likes, and they chased the popularity, which is fine. That's what they do. But what we feel is that at some point, look outside that courthouse, right? The family heard the cheers. Brother, friend, son. They heard the cheers, and it was devastating, right? So
again, it's like, okay, but John, I'm a professional person. I may not always look or act or sound like it, but I have spent my entire life dedicated 25 years, not only to working as a psychological professional, clinical professional, but in school studying psychology, physiology, studying how the mind and body systems work together to create our experience, studying behavior. I'm a very serious person. I'm also a big time nerd. And what I will tell you is there's absolutely no world where, unless the evidence was so overwhelming, so thorough, so convincing, that I would be willing to put my credibility on the line to fight for this woman who I am certain did not murder John O'Keefe. And yet, this man here calls himself a friend, truly believes that the way to get justice was to drag the woman that John O'Keefe was in a love relationship with at the time of his death, is to drag her through hell and back for years. That's his version of justice. You would think at some point, instead of doubling down, as everybody on the Commonwealth team has done in this case from the start, you might at some point stop and ask yourself the most important question, which is why? Why are all of these people, folks like myself who've never protested anything in my entire life, why was I summoned to drive, 4 hours from here? I didn't drive from here, but 4 hours from here, right outside of Boston, Massachusetts, from New York City. Why was I called to leave my life and spend 8 hours outside of the courtroom in Dedham wearing pink and screaming and cheering or making the love symbol? Because the evidence is overwhelming in this case. It's not a question, right? So for all of us, people all over the world, to be so incredibly supportive. And by the way, people in Dedham on that day came from all over the US. People drove from Texas, Alabama, you name it. And it is the most wonderful, loving, and supportive group of human beings in the world. Just kind people who feel very, very strongly that an enormous injustice, and I'm not just talking about the way Karen Read has been treated, but I'm talking about that a police officer's life was taken and that John O'Keefe was tossed outside like trash so that the people in the house could protect themselves. When we start at one place and we are unwilling to let go of that one very, very rigid idea, our brain has no choice but to find a way to pick from the evidence in the world around us to match that original belief.
The media needs to take responsibility for their part in this. I'm not saying it was totally there, but for their part in this, for allowing themselves to choose sides, for allowing themselves to be part of the fuel for that fire that caught and wound up outside of that courthouse.
So you see how in his world, two things, right? Number one, I mean, he's absolutely sure and a guilty woman just was freed. Like he can't understand that the media, and by the way, I mean, this is absurd. The media, the mainstream media, has not been supportive of Karen Read at all. Not at all. Not in the least bit. If anything, we've seen more from the O'Keefe family side in the mainstream media on ABC Good Morning America than we have anybody from the Karen Read side. So the idea that the mainstream media is somehow perpetrating some great injustice or false belief is just, number one, absurd. And again, shows you that he's selectively picking because he has to find a way to make sense of what's happening right now. Because, you know, human beings have a part of our brain, it's called the interpreter. And its job is to make sense of the reality that we are experiencing. That's its job. And this is how John Jackson is making sense of his reality. He's saying that, well, and you know, it's the media's fault. And by the way, think of how absurd that is. The mainstream media has been overwhelmingly more supportive of the O'Keefe family and of their belief than of Karen Read. I mean, even A Body in the Snow really didn't paint Karen Read as innocent. And that wound up, obviously, being the only damaging aspect of the Commonwealth's case in chief, were her little clips. That's how she ended up with the OUI. So the fact that John Jackson really, I mean, you can see he really believes this. He believes that a guilty woman just went free and it's the media's fault. I mean, it's really sad. It's really sad because he just can't see it. He doesn't understand that we absolutely not only believe that Karen Read didn't do this, we know she didn't do it. And we know that the people who really murdered John O'Keefe are not only free, but have befriended the O'Keefe family, which is terrifying. Just terrifying. Very scary.
So yeah, some of the blame goes there.
So go ahead. No, continue. I don't want to cut you off. I thought you were done. Continue.
Look, so the problem is for us too. We've lived this for 3.5 years, and you know, we've every piece of evidence that came in, both sides. You know, we can be objective about it and say when things went poorly for us and when things went well for us.
So this is fascinating. It's just fascinating. He is saying we can be objective and say when things went poorly for us or when they went well for us. But what he can't be objective about is the evidence itself. Right? And it's very interesting because, again, like I said, it's clear to me that John Jackson makes a concerted effort over and over again throughout this interview. And it comes across very strong to me. He wants us to believe that he's a smart man, that he's a level-headed man, that he's not just emotional, that yes, this is an emotional experience, but that he's not a irrational human being. He wants us to see him as logical, and he keeps trying to interject that in all these different ways, including by telling us that he could be objective. But what he doesn't realize is that he's entirely, absolutely closed, absolutely not objective, not in the least. And you could even make the argument, certainly I could make the argument as a psychologist, that this man is not capable of being objective because he's so emotionally invested in being right and in Karen Read being guilty, to the point where there's no way for his brain to allow objectivity. Like, he can't imagine that ARCA doesn't have some ulterior motive. Like, they must, right? Because how else can you make sense of the exculpatory evidence that ARCA presented? They had to have been wrong somehow, because in this man's mind, they can't be what they seem in order for Karen Read to also be guilty. The two things can't be true at the same time. And he's trying to say, no, I'm a reasonable person. I can be objective, but clearly nothing could be farther from the truth here.
And it just, even when things went well for us, again, Juror 11 here, look, Ms. Hank Brennan, Adam Lally, Attorney McLaughlin, they put on a good case. And it's unfortunate because I'm looking now, this doesn't look like it ever had a chance. It doesn't. A couple of other jurors I've spoken to, and I wasn't going to go there with this, but I can't even, literally raw emotions are coming out here. So that's not where I wanted to go tonight. I wanted to be calm and talk about Johnny and the pain that this family is definitely experiencing.
So, yeah, and we've heard from other jurors that are speaking. Do you at all look at the investigation itself, the way things were handled that night?
Sure.
I know there was a nor'easter coming in. I know that is difficult, but it's Massachusetts, not securing the scene, other things that were pointed out to the jury, because they kept saying to me, not just this juror, but other jurors, holes in the investigation. There were holes in the investigation.
Sure. I can address that, sure. So again, me personally, I'm not speaking for anybody else here, but I will say that, the investigation found the right person. My personal opinion is that maybe, especially with a police officer involved, maybe a little more follow through, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and I'm being, I'm softening it a little bit. But am I happy with the investigation? No. But did they come up with the right person? Yes.
So let me ask you a question about this. And again, if John was in front of me, I would ask this question to him. How can you be sure that they got the right person if they did not do a thorough and complete investigation? The only evidence, and this is exactly why this group of Massachusetts state police officers, investigators, the reason why they planted taillight evidence was exactly for this reason, because they knew definitively there was no evidence that Karen Read was guilty. There was no evidence. And again, as you know, we get all we need from Michael Proctor's text messages that were sent within 10 hours of Michael Proctor being put onto the case. So we know, and by the way, Michael Proctor in the last few days has reiterated that he doesn't think that there's anything wrong with the investigation that he conducted, which shows you and highlights just the intelligence level that we are dealing with here. And it's sad. It's sad and it's terrifying at the least, because what happened is quite clear. Michael Proctor and the rest of that office, led by Brian Tully and of course by Michael Morrissey, they figured that they weren't going to have enough evidence, but that because there was a crack in Karen Read's taillight and John O'Keefe did not have a shoe on, he lost a shoe, that she must have done it. And so to ensure that, they planted taillight. Now, how do we know they planted taillight? Because ARCA has made the physics very, very clear for us to understand.
The debris that comes off of the taillight, the fragments, what speed would they be going at the point of impact when they crack and are released from the taillight?
At the impact speed or less.
In order to penetrate the sweatshirt and cut the arm across, would the shards have to be going faster or slower than the arm?
They would have to be going faster. If they're moving at a common velocity with the arm relative to it, they would somehow have to accelerate with more speed to catch up and go beyond the arm, essentially.
Is that physically possible?
No.
You can see here again also the light and the fragments are being propelled forward. So you also have to consider where Mr. O'Keefe was found. He was found in the yard about 10 or 20 feet from the road. There was no exact measurements. But if you look at the motion of the taillight, it's going forward. Now, if Mr. O'Keefe has to move diagonally to the top left of that corner, and if he's not hit with the center of mass, he can't get to where he ends up before the taillight fragments have already gone forward and been deposited on the ground. Average running speed is like 4 to 6 miles an hour. Even if this SUV is going 10 miles an hour, it shatters, the lights fracture, they're dispersed on the ground, and then Mr. O'Keefe somehow ends up to his point of rest. But you wouldn't find the fragments on him because they've already been pushed forward, come to rest, before he even has a chance to get to where they find him.
When it becomes impossible for John O'Keefe to have sustained his injuries from a car, from a vehicle, when it is impossible that taillight pieces could be on John O'Keefe's clothing based on where he was found at the scene, there's absolutely no way that John was hit by a taillight by Karen Reed, and therefore somebody had to put those pieces of taillight there. And because there was no taillight pieces found during the first search, it's pretty obvious. And that group of investigators, which include Tully and Proctor and Buchanan, admit that they got together at the police station to discuss the taillight. That's one of the things that Proctor says. Or Buchanan says, that was the purpose of their meeting. I mean, Tully holds the search up on purpose. He intentionally holds up the search, holds up the CERT team, brings with him 5 guys who are dressed head to toe, unrecognizable. And because of the unusual set of circumstances, Tully is in charge of this group, not O'Hara, who would normally be in charge of the CERT team. So to me, there is just an overwhelming amount of evidence that points in the direction of these cops planting the evidence. And Michael Proctor might be able to look at you square in the face and tell you that he didn't do it because he wasn't the one to physically take those taillight pieces and bring them to 34 Fairview.
Did you plant evidence?
Absolutely not. And I'm laughing because it's such a ridiculous accusation. It's something I would never do. I've never done.
You know, most people would.
And there's no evidence of it.
We're talking about people in your community, your neighbors, who believe it. This is not strangers. This is people in Canton. Why do you think that is?
That's just the loud minority. The silent majority we've had an overwhelming amount of support. They're just not out there tweeting.
Such strong negative feelings about Karen Reed that you would say things like, hopefully she kills herself, or calling her the C word.
Those feelings developed as the case went on.
I mean, can you see how people might think, he was caught in this instance speaking about a suspect in this way. Maybe it's happened in other cases as well.
I 100% understand why people would think that. But when you have, a fellow police officer around my age, 2 kids of his own, it generates an emotion. And I express those emotions in a negative way, which I shouldn't have. I shouldn't even, been texting my friends anything. They are what they are. They don't define me as a person. They're regrettable.
Like it takes a Trooper Paul-like explanation to make sense of how it is that car could have hit John O'Keefe and he could have landed where he did and he could have had the injuries that he had. But that doesn't matter because it's the only way that John Jackson can make sense of what is happening. And it's all our fault. At the end of the day, it's all our fault. They never had a chance because this jury was rigged against them from the start.
Right. So the evidence in this case points to one person, or one person only. And we've followed the social media, we've followed the online stuff and all the other media, and it, the reality is the wrong narrative still exists. The wrong narrative is still out there. They're talking about third-party culprits, and it's all nonsense.
Wow, you see how upset he is about this, right? He's so upset. He's so sure that it's all nonsense. He's so sure, which means that in order to be this sure and this outraged at all of us for telling a different story than the one that he wants us to tell, you cannot allow yourself to imagine that the people at 34 Fairview could be nefarious in any way, that any of their behavior could be nefarious. That is the bigger problem for this group of people. They cannot allow that to be true because that is so terrifying. Imagine waking up, realizing that Brian Albert is the one who really killed your son, your brother, your friend, and he's been like a shadow over your shoulder this entire time. That's scary. That is a scary proposition. That all these people who have been smiling, who have been by your side, bringing you dishes, helping out with the kids, doing whatever that they've done to try to be helpful, are actually your son's murderers. I mean, it is terrifying in a way that is beyond one's ability to really comprehend. And therefore, if this man starts looking at the evidence objectively and he comes to that conclusion, he has to shut that door and go, nope, Karen Read is guilty. And how could he possibly see the evidence when you hear him say all the evidence points to one person? It's like, what evidence points to Karen Read in this case? Where is that evidence? Because I don't see any evidence. But this is perfect example of confirmation bias and how it works. And you can feel the emotion. He believes this. This isn't BS. I mean, he believes it.
One person did this. We know it. We've known it since the beginning.
And remember, when you heard Paulo Keefe's interview after the last trial.
Oh, we know what happened. We know that Johnny and Karen were arguing. It was kind of towards the end of their relationship. Things weren't well. They were drinking and arguing and fighting, and in an intoxicated state of rage and jealousy, she just decided that she was going to do something about it, and put the car in reverse and ran him down and left him there to die. And we figured it out as soon as she left the house that day when she came over. We didn't talk to any investigators, state police, nobody. My mother had said, do you think she had something to do with this? And I said, we're not going to think like that. Went outside to the driveway to look at her car, and her car was gone. It was a blizzard. I knew what the driving conditions were like coming from the hospital to Canton. And I knew that they were going back to Dighton, which is a much further drive. Mm-hmm. So we put it together pretty quickly.
Before there was ever any evidence, and therefore anything that's presented after that, any information that was conflicting with that idea from the very start, from first hour after this happens, they just ignore. And they have to find a way to ignore. And so, if you just keep ignoring any evidence that opposes your belief, of course you're going to believe that Karen Read is guilty because that's the only evidence you've ever considered.
And you want to talk about the investigation? I understand. Look, beyond a reasonable doubt is the standard. We get it. And we can have an honest conversation about whether or not, beyond a reasonable doubt, the threshold was met here. I believe it was. But if you want to talk about specifically maybe the collision, whether or not a collision happened, I mean, you can have that argument. I think a totality of the evidence shows, it happened. But
right. Again, you see how he's doing this thing again, where he's trying to come back to logic and being reasonable, because this is a real conflict for this guy. I mean, I got to tell you, this guy is very torn. There is a part of him that absolutely realizes that the objective evidence is not favorable to the theory that he has about Karen Read being guilty. He knows this is not a dumb guy. He knows, but he's really conflicted about it. I mean, deeply conflicted. He just cannot allow himself to nudge over to the other side. I mean, and now you have to imagine, because John is gone and being a support to his family is much more important, right? To him, the most important. So it is not only that it would be scary to admit that Karen Read is not guilty, because then it points to the people in the house. It also means going up against John's family and like losing the only real connection that you have to this man who you loved, who you lost. So that's another thing that makes it impossible for John Jackson to consider the evidence objectively. But how clear is it? How clear is it that he is torn? I mean, he's so torn. I think it's a pretty reasonable that, yeah, I mean, the totality of the evidence, he clearly understands that that is a very questionable argument.
You want to have like an honest conversation about whether that happened or whether they proved it or not. I think they did. If a juror came out and said, look, I just don't believe in a collision, fine. But when they come out and they say things like, it wasn't 100%, instead of, if it was 99, then you can't convict. I mean, not understanding reasonable doubt, totality of the evidence, not understanding their job. I mean, they say they understood their job, but they didn't.
And here's what I've taken from the jury. The jurors saw the defense, saw it the way the defense saw it. Most of them saw the case the way the defense saw it. There wasn't enough information to be certain beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, were they using euphemisms like 100%? Were they taking their job very seriously? That if they were not certain that Karen Read was guilty, they were not going to take a woman's liberty away. And I think that's the point that these jurors are making and that they've made consistently. There was just nowhere near enough evidence to be willing and allow myself to take a woman's liberties away. And particularly given how horrific the cops in this case were. And by the way, Michael Proctor was the boogeyman, but the guy that they brought into court, which was Yuri Buchanan, that was the person that Paula, juror number 11, who they're talking about here, that's the one that was the one person that she pointed to as the turning point for her, was Yuri Buchanan. The truth is that the only entity that you have to blame, John Jackson, for this case winding up the way it is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because from the beginning, they absolutely botched this case in every way, shape, and form. And the investigators from Michael Morrissey's office are so subpar that they absolutely made it impossible for us to ever be able to say with 100% certainty what happened here. But I'm pretty freaking close. I got to tell you, I'm as close as I could get to 100% without somebody telling me definitively. I'm as close to 100% as you can get.
I didn't get it, or at least that one, I should say.
Right.
So yeah. Again, investigation found the right person. I would have liked a little more follow through. But maybe things will change because of this case, right? You would hope that when investigations happen now, they would have to sort of foresee that maybe a wealthy defendant would be able to purchase the circus,
Maybe a wealthy defendant will be able to purchase the circus. So you really wonder about that, right? I mean, you have to ask yourself, does that mean that one of the ways that John has made sense of this is to say that Karen Read had so much money that she paid Turtle Boy and then paid all of us to show up across from the Dedham courthouse? I mean, what is the thinking there? And I know what the thinking is, right? I know what the thinking is. Again, remember, if the belief that I have to protect at all costs is Karen Read is guilty, then anything that I see, like thousands of people from across the world in support of Karen Read, I'm going to have no choice in my logical brain but to explain that away with, well, they're all paid off. Or how about the fact that Karen's entire defense team didn't make any money off this trial? The trial of their lives didn't make any money. How do you reason that? How does John Jackson reason that? They're lying? I mean, it's amazing. It's really amazing. And it's sad. It's a lot of other things too. But the only reason why I wanted to show you guys this is because of how powerful your brain really is, how powerful beliefs are, and how they really govern our perception. There's a scientist in Boston named Lisa Feldman Barrett, who I love, and she talks about how when her daughter was little, they had a disgusting food party, and they took like peanut butter or like mashed up potatoes or whatever, and they like served it in diapers. And she talked about how people were literally gagging, even though they knew it was just sweet potatoes mashed up. And there was a lot of examples of things just like that. Because when you believe that what you're looking at is a dirty diaper, even though it's just sweet potatoes being served to you on a dish that looks like a diaper, your brain will cause a gag reflex. It will cause you to physically be sick, and it will also, in some cases, cause you to smell a dirty diaper. Because when your brain believes something, it has such hardwired expectations that come along with it that it finds a way to match the sensory information in front of you to your beliefs, to your expectations. And that is exactly what John Jackson is highlighting to us here. So to those folks who are hoping that like ARCA or Dr. La Posada, one of the defense witnesses or the totality of the evidence presented by Karen Read's defense team would somehow wake up somebody in the O'Keefe family. The truth is, that's just fundamentally impossible because they are so totally invested, not only in Karen Read being guilty, but in protecting that belief. And there's a lot of reasons why. So they have to find a way to make all these other things the problem. Everything but the fact that that belief is incorrect. Wild stuff. Wild stuff.
So that's how I see it. So yeah, if you want to have an honest discussion about reasonable doubt, I could probably get on board with that. But the other stuff, she said, this last juror talked about the dog bites. Barrows, she never listened to Hank Brennan's. I mean, Aperture was unprofessional. I mean, look, you say what you want, but you can go after the individual if you want. But Shannon Burgess, he found the chip that put the data that put her car there. She was the one who drove the car forward 30 and change feet, and then reversed and another 50 feet at a high rate of speed. Even that juror said she said it. She says she doesn't know what. Maybe she hit him, but then he went in the house after with his socks on. I mean, oh my God, he didn't have a shot. There was never a shot here, and so the emotions you hear now is I'm transitioning away from the grief and the disbelief. We're pragmatic about it. We understood that this could happen, but this is not what we expected. We expected a more deliberate jury, I guess, would be the best way to say
it. Fascinating. Very interesting stuff there. You could see in the end, in this last segment, that once again, John Jackson can't imagine that these people would have pored over the evidence and came to the conclusion that Karen Read is innocent, or that there wasn't enough to convict a woman for the rest of her life. Even up through the end, you see what I mean about John Jackson trying to present himself as a pragmatic person, as a reasonable person. Maybe I could have a conversation with you about reasonable doubt. But then, because he believes so strongly that Karen Read is guilty and that the evidence was just so conclusive, he can't understand how they could believe in the dog bites. Right? He can't understand how they could believe Barrows or how they didn't believe Burgess. This man is very conflicted, and we see it in everything he's saying. He's having such a hard time because he considers himself a logical, a reasonable person. He's trying to be pragmatic. He's trying to remain calm. He's having a really hard time understanding how his version of reality could be so discrepant from the version that the rest of us are experiencing, which includes the 12 people that ultimately decided Karen Read's fate. And it's fascinating to watch. All right, that is it for me. So much content, so much going on. It's endless. I will see you guys again very soon.
God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything.